Hello, dear friends. You're about to hear a story from 1944 called Operation Market Garden. Enjoy! Autumn 1944 marked a pivotal moment in the Second World War. Across Europe, the Allied armies were pressing forward with a combination of momentum and urgency. The Normandy landings had succeeded, the hedgerows of northern France were behind them, and the German forces were retreating. Paris had been liberated, and the morale of the Allied forces soared. Yet, for all the optimism, there remained an urgent question. How quickly could the war be brought to an end? The world had endured years of brutality, and every month of delay meant more lives lost, more cities destroyed, and more suffering endured. In this climate, Allied planners conceived an audacious plan, one that combined boldness with strategic calculation. Instead of advancing slowly along a broad front, why not strike deep into German-held territory and aim for a decisive blow? The idea was simple in principle but daring in execution. Seize a series of vital bridges across rivers and canals in the Netherlands, secure them against enemy counterattacks, and drive a ground force rapidly into the German heartland. This operation, which would become known as Operation Market Garden, was to be the gamble that might shorten the war by months or even bring it to an end. The operation relied on two interlocking components: Market, the airborne assault, and Garden, the rapid ground advance. Market would deploy tens of thousands of paratroopers from American, British, and Polish units behind enemy lines. Their mission was to capture bridges intact and hold them against German counterattacks. Garden would send armored divisions up a single narrow highway, famously nicknamed Hell's Highway, to link up with the airborne forces and secure the corridor. Every success, every delay, and every setback along this route would directly affect the outcome. The planners were acutely aware of the risks. Airborne forces were vulnerable during the drop, transport planes could be intercepted, and enemy units could regroup unexpectedly. The narrowness of Hell's Highway meant that any obstruction, ambush, or destroyed bridge could halt the advance and isolate the paratroopers. Yet, the gamble depended precisely on speed, surprise, and audacity. Intelligence suggested that the Germans were weaker in the Netherlands than elsewhere, but even a small miscalculation could lead to disaster. For the soldiers involved, the stakes were immediate and personal. Paratroopers trained endlessly, rehearsing jumps, organizing equipment, and preparing to fight in unfamiliar terrain immediately after landing. Ground troops practiced rapid armored advances, supply convoys coordinated their routes, and engineers calculated river crossings down to the minute. Every element had to synchronize perfectly. The courage of these men was matched only by the precision required of them. Failure was not an abstract concept, it could be instantaneous and deadly. Maps and reconnaissance photographs were studied tirelessly. Commanders like Field Marshal Montgomery and Generals Gavin, Urquhart, and Browning examined every bridge, canal, and road, assessing enemy positions and determining the fastest approach. Briefings emphasized timing, coordination, and the importance of holding every link in the chain. Soldiers were told that every minute counted, and every movement would shape the fate of the operation. As September 17th approached, the atmosphere shifted from preparation to anticipation. Transport aircraft lined up on runways, gliders were loaded with artillery, jeeps, and light tanks, and paratroopers waited silently in their planes. The calm was tense. Every man understood that the coming hours would test courage, skill, and the limits of planning. The gamble was about to be made, a calculated risk that combined speed, daring, and hope, with the potential to change the course of the war. At dawn, the first planes would lift off, carrying the soldiers who would leap into enemy territory, bridging rivers and towns that had been under German control for years. It was a plan that would demand everything of the men involved: their discipline, endurance, and bravery. Success would shorten the war, failure could cost thousands of lives. In these final hours before the operation, the world held its breath as the Allies prepared to stake everything on a single, audacious gamble. Following the initial excitement and strategic vision of Operation Market Garden, the next step was meticulous planning. Allied commanders understood that boldness alone would not secure victory. Every element of the operation had to be coordinated with clockwork precision. The plan was both ambitious and delicate, a combined airborne and ground assault, stretching over 64 kilometers of Dutch terrain, designed to seize a series of key bridges and create a direct route into Germany. It was an operation built entirely on speed, timing, and coordination. The airborne component, codenamed Market, was to be the spearhead. More than 35,000 paratroopers from the American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, the British 1st Airborne Division, and the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade were assigned to capture bridges over rivers, canals, and urban streets. Each bridge was a critical link. Failure to secure even one could halt the entire advance. Intelligence had identified potential German forces in the area, but the Allies believed speed and surprise could compensate for incomplete knowledge. The plan demanded that troops not only land accurately but also move quickly from drop zones to their objectives under enemy fire. Simultaneously, the ground assault, known as Garden, relied on a single highway, later infamously dubbed Hell's Highway. This narrow route was the lifeline connecting airborne troops to the main Allied forces. Armored divisions, supported by infantry, engineers, and logistics units, would advance rapidly, carrying supplies, heavy weapons, and reinforcements. Their task was to relieve the airborne units and maintain the momentum of the operation. Any delays along this highway could isolate the paratroopers and render their efforts futile. Engineers prepared to clear obstacles, repair bridges, and build makeshift crossings in anticipation of resistance or sabotage. Planning this operation required extraordinary coordination between land, air, and logistics units. Transport aircraft, gliders, and paratroopers had to arrive within minutes of each other. Each C-47 Dakota carrying soldiers, weapons, and supplies was precisely timed to land at specific drop zones. Gliders brought jeeps, artillery, and even light tanks, ready to support infantry as soon as they hit the ground. Radio communications were mapped out, contingency plans were drawn for every possible disruption. The operation was a ballet of men and machines, choreographed to unfold flawlessly over days of combat. The landscape of the Netherlands presented both strategic opportunities and unique challenges. Its canals, dikes, rivers, and narrow roads demanded precision. A destroyed bridge or an ambush on Hell's Highway could bring the advance to a standstill. Yet, the Allies believed their speed and surprise would negate these risks. Maps and reconnaissance photos were studied relentlessly. Troops rehearsed movements, engineers calculated river crossings, and commanders discussed every conceivable scenario. The pressure was immense. Success depended on timing down to the minute, on maintaining momentum despite resistance, and on the ability to adapt rapidly to unforeseen circumstances. High-level meetings reflected both optimism and tension. Field Marshal Montgomery and his generals meticulously reviewed the plan, discussing how airborne and ground elements would interact. They considered German reinforcements, possible counterattacks, and the vulnerability of their stretched supply lines. Intelligence suggested that German units in the Netherlands were weaker than in France, but assumptions about enemy strength were dangerous. The operation's success relied not on overwhelming force but on coordination, audacity, and timing. One miscalculation could doom the entire endeavor. For the soldiers, the planning translated into intensive preparation. Paratroopers trained for precise drops, glider pilots practiced landings under simulated fire, and infantry prepared for immediate assault upon linking with airborne units. Supplies were meticulously packed. Weapons, ammunition, radios, and rations all had to be delivered intact. The stakes were clear. Speed would determine life or death. Even before takeoff, the tension was palpable, as every man understood that a single delay or error could have catastrophic consequences. By the time September 17th arrived, all elements of Market Garden were in position. Transport planes were loaded, gliders were ready, and troops awaited the signal. Engineers prepared bridges, medics stood by, and commanders checked their maps one final time. The operation had been planned in extraordinary detail, yet it retained an inherent fragility. A single destroyed bridge, an unexpected German unit, or a delay in communications could unravel the entire mission. And yet, the confidence in planning, speed, and audacity carried the Allied forces forward. The gamble was set, the stakes could not be higher. Operation Market Garden, as it was about to unfold, was a testament to both human ingenuity and the risks of war. The combination of airborne audacity and rapid ground movement represented a pinnacle of Allied planning, but it also revealed the razor-thin margin between triumph and disaster. Every map, every glider, every minute of synchronized timing was a piece of a grand chessboard, and the first moves were about to be made. September 17, 1944. Dawned crisp and tense over southern England as the first waves of transport aircraft taxied along the runways, engines humming in anticipation. Thousands of paratroopers, fully equipped and mentally braced for the unknown, prepared to leap into enemy territory. This was the beginning of Operation Market Garden's most daring component. The airborne assault, codenamed Market, over 35,000 men from the American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, the British 1st Airborne Division, and the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade were to drop behind German lines, seize key bridges, and hold them until the ground forces of Operation Garden could arrive. The stakes were colossal, the timing unforgiving, and the terrain unfamiliar and treacherous. As the first C-47 Dakotas lifted off the tarmac, paratroopers sat silently, checking harnesses, tightening straps, and reviewing final orders. Gliders, carrying artillery, jeeps, and light tanks were to follow closely, ready to provide immediate firepower and mobility. Pilots knew that every second mattered. A delayed drop could mean disaster, leaving soldiers isolated and exposed to enemy fire. The scale of the operation was unprecedented, demanding flawless coordination between aircrews, navigators, and the men jumping into the unknown. The first drops were relatively smooth. Paratroopers descended into fields, canals, and small towns, the landscape of the Netherlands stretching below them. The initial objectives were clear: capture bridges over the Maas, Waal, and Rhine rivers, as well as critical crossroads and towns. Each bridge was a tactical keystone. Without it, the armored ground columns could not advance. In some areas, the German forces were caught off guard, and the paratroopers moved quickly to secure their targets. Bridges were held with determination, and towns were cleared, often after fierce firefights in the streets. Yet, even the best laid plans soon faced the harsh reality of combat. Weather conditions shifted, with low clouds and miscomplicating navigation. Some aircraft missed their designated drop zones, scattering troops across fields and marshes. Communication difficulties further hampered coordination, leaving isolated groups to improvise under enemy fire. The paratroopers quickly adapted, using training, discipline, and courage to achieve local objectives even when separated from their units. Small squads held bridges and crossroads against counterattacks, demonstrating the resilience and ingenuity that would define airborne operations. The British 1st Airborne Division, assigned to capture the Arnhem Bridge, faced immediate challenges, dropped several kilometers from their objective due to navigation errors. They had to fight through German positions, encountering stiff resistance from armored and infantry units. The famous phrase "a bridge too far" began to resonate even in these early hours, as the difficulty of linking airborne forces with ground support became painfully evident. Meanwhile, the Americans in Eindhoven and Nijmegen fared better initially, capturing key bridges and establishing defensive positions to secure the corridor. For the approaching armored divisions, glider landings added another layer of complexity. These fragile aircraft delivered artillery pieces, jeeps, and even light tanks, often under fire. Pilots risked everything to land in fields and open spaces, sometimes losing control and crashing. Yet the material they carried was critical for the airborne forces to hold captured positions. Infantry units quickly integrated with these reinforcements, establishing strong points, preparing for counterattacks, and fortifying captured bridges. Throughout the day, reports of scattered engagements, heroic defenses, and unexpected German resistance began to filter back to command centers. Successes were celebrated cautiously, tempered by awareness of the tenuous hold-on objectives and the uncertainty of the ground advance. Every soldier understood that time was the most precious commodity. Holding bridges and towns longer than anticipated could mean survival or annihilation. By nightfall, Operation Market had achieved partial success. Several key bridges were under Allied control, and towns had been cleared, but not all objectives were met. The British forces at Arnhem were isolated, facing increasing German pressure, while American paratroopers had to fend off sporadic counterattacks. The gap between airborne forces and the approaching ground troops highlighted the fragility of the plan. The gamble was in full motion. The bravery and initiative of individual soldiers would determine whether the operation could maintain momentum or descend into chaos. As darkness fell, the soldiers prepared for a night of uncertainty. Signals were checked, defenses reinforced, and exhausted troops tended to the wounded. Every man understood that the following days would test endurance, resolve, and coordination to their limits. The airborne assault had demonstrated both the audacity of Allied planning and the harsh reality of combat. Victory was possible, but only through courage, adaptability, and sheer determination. Market Garden's gamble was underway, and the first moves on the Dutch chessboard had been made. While the airborne troops were fighting to secure bridges and towns, the ground forces of Operation Garden began their advance along the narrow, vulnerable route that would soon earn the name Hell's Highway. For the armored divisions, this was a race against time. Every minute mattered. The paratroopers were holding fragile footholds across the Dutch countryside, and any delay could turn their daring success into disaster. The road itself was a strategic bottleneck. A single-lane highway stretched for dozens of kilometers through towns, fields, and dikes, flanked by canals and forests. Any obstruction, burning vehicles, destroyed bridges, or ambushed columns could halt the advance entirely. Engineers followed closely behind the lead tanks, ready to clear obstacles, repair bridges, and construct makeshift crossings. But even with careful planning, progress was slower than anticipated. German units, reorganizing faster than Allied intelligence had predicted, launched repeated counterattacks, setting up ambushes along the highway and slowing the columns to a crawl. As the armored forces inched forward, the reality of logistics became starkly apparent. Convoys stretched for miles, making coordination difficult. Artillery and supply trucks lagged behind, and communication lines were frequently interrupted. Paratroopers, isolated behind enemy lines, radioed urgent requests for reinforcements. At times, ground units were confronted with destroyed or mined roads, forcing detours that further delayed the advance. Each delay increased the pressure on airborne troops, who had to fend off German attacks with limited supplies. The British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem faced the gravest peril. Dropped several kilometers from their objective, they fought their way through German defenses. But as hours turned into days, their isolation grew critical. Attempts to link up with the ground forces were repeatedly frustrated by ambushes, artillery, and enemy reinforcements. The narrow highway prevented rapid movement, turning what was meant to be a swift relief into a perilous struggle against time and terrain. Soldiers on both sides understood that success or failure hinged on controlling this single road. In addition to enemy resistance, the geography worked against the Allies. Canals and rivers limited maneuverability, towns became choke points, and even minor setbacks could block the entire column. German forces, having learned from earlier defeats in France and Belgium, had prepared defensive positions and were quick to exploit Allied vulnerabilities. The advancing troops faced sporadic artillery fire, small arms ambushes, and armored counterattacks, each of which slowed the advance and inflicted casualties. Despite these challenges, the Allies pushed forward. Engineers and infantry cleared obstacles under fire, tanks led convoys through towns under attack, and supply trucks fought to maintain the lifeline to the paratroopers. Coordination between ground and airborne units required constant radio communication and improvisation. Every successful bridge crossing or cleared town was a hard-won victory, celebrated briefly before the next challenge emerged. The situation at Arnhem, however, demonstrated the peril of overextension. British forces were forced to dig in on high ground and canal banks, forming defensive positions to hold off superior numbers of German troops. The concept of a rapid, linking advance had begun to falter. For the men on the ground, the gamble of Market Garden had turned into a desperate fight for survival. Every hour of delay meant increased exposure to German counterattacks and dwindling supplies. By the second night, it was evident that the operation's success depended on extraordinary endurance and improvisation. Ground units were exhausted, paratroopers had already sustained heavy casualties, and commanders had to constantly adjust plans. What had begun as a bold thrust through the Netherlands was becoming a struggle to maintain momentum. With soldiers on both sides fighting for every bridge, road, and field, the tension was palpable. A single destroyed bridge, a miscalculated maneuver, or a delayed convoy could determine the fate of thousands of men. Despite these hardships, the Allied troops pressed on, each bridge secured, each ambush repelled, and each kilometer gained along the highway represented not only tactical success, but also the will to maintain the operation's ambitious goals. The bravery, skill, and improvisation of these forces were remarkable, yet the fragility of the plan was increasingly apparent. The narrow corridor, fierce German resistance, and logistical challenges had transformed what was meant to be a rapid advance into a tense and deadly struggle. By the end of Part 4, the stage was set for the dramatic climax. The isolated British forces at Arnhem, the slow-moving armored column, and the tenuous link between air and ground forces would determine whether Market Garden's audacious gamble would result in triumph or catastrophe. The operation, once built on speed and precision, now balanced on courage, endurance, and the unforgiving realities of war. By the final days of September 1944, it became painfully clear that Operation Market Garden had not gone according to plan. The audacious gamble that had promised a swift end to the war now teetered on the edge of disaster. The British 1st Airborne Division, isolated at Arnhem, had fought with courage and determination. But the gap between airborne forces and the slow-moving armored columns proved fatal. Supplies dwindled, casualties mounted, and German forces consolidated their strength, effectively cutting off the paratroopers from relief. The phrase "a bridge too far" had become reality. Despite initial successes in Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and other towns, the narrow Hell's Highway created vulnerabilities that could not be overcome. Roadblocks, destroyed bridges, ambushes, and persistent German counterattacks slowed the ground advance and made the resupply of airborne forces almost impossible. Every attempt to reach Arnhem was met with fierce resistance, artillery fire, and strategic obstacles. Time, which had been the Allies' greatest asset, became their most critical enemy. Each day of delay allowed German units to reinforce positions, making what had been an audacious push for victory a desperate struggle for survival. The paratroopers at Arnhem faced harrowing conditions. Encircled and outnumbered, they dug in along the northern bank of the Rhine, establishing defensive positions under constant bombardment. Food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies ran dangerously low. Yet, their discipline and determination never wavered. Small units mounted counterattacks, held critical positions, and evacuated the wounded under fire. The human cost of the operation became staggering. Thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The bravery of these men, however, ensured that key positions were held far longer than any observer could have predicted. On the German side, rapid adaptation turned the tide. Units that had initially been disorganized were quickly reinforced and strategically redeployed. Leaders recognized the threat posed by the airborne landings and the narrow corridor of Hell's Highway, and they exploited it with precision. Artillery, tanks, and infantry coordinated to strike at both the isolated paratroopers and the stretched ground forces. The Allies had underestimated German resilience and the ability to respond swiftly, and the consequences were devastating. Ultimately, the Arnhem Bridge could not be held. The remaining British paratroopers were forced to withdraw under cover of darkness, leaving behind the fallen and their hard-won positions. Although Market Garden achieved partial success, bridges in Eindhoven and Nijmegen were captured. Towns were liberated, and German forces were disrupted. It failed in its primary objective, to secure a continuous route across the Rhine into Germany. The ambitious plan to end the war in months rather than years had collapsed. Yet, the legacy of Market Garden extends beyond its immediate failure. It demonstrated the potential of airborne operations on a massive scale, the critical importance of speed and coordination, and the consequences of overextending logistics and forces. Lessons learned from Arnhem influenced subsequent Allied planning, emphasizing intelligence, reconnaissance, and the integration of air and ground operations. The operation also became a symbol of courage, resilience, and sacrifice, inspiring stories, books, and films for generations. In the years that followed, historians and veterans debated whether Market Garden was a brilliant gamble or a strategic miscalculation. The operation revealed the thin line between audacity and overreach, and the price of misjudging terrain, enemy strength, and timing. It underscored the human element of warfare. Leadership, courage, improvisation, and endurance could achieve remarkable feats, but they could not always overcome the harsh realities of combat. For the soldiers who participated, the operation left lasting memories of bravery, loss, and camaraderie. Families mourned the fallen, communities honored the survivors, and the Netherlands remembered the liberation effort that had brought Allied forces to its towns, even if only partially successful. Today, Operation Market Garden is studied in military academies worldwide as both a cautionary tale and an example of daring strategy, reminding us that in war, the boldest plans carry the highest risks. In the end, Market Garden's failure was not a defeat of spirit. It was a testament to the extraordinary efforts of men and women who undertook one of the most ambitious military operations of the Second World War, facing overwhelming odds with courage, resilience, and determination. Though the bridge at Arnhem remained in enemy hands, the operation changed the course of military history, leaving lessons that continue to inform strategy, leadership, and the understanding of war itself. Thank you so much for watching. You'll hear lots of interesting stories on this channel. We look forward to seeing you again.